And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Taking a look at the aviation weather, starting with flying weather on Saturday morning with a trough pushing through the state. Friday into Saturday, we'll be looking at some marginal conditions through portions of the Alaska range and down through the North Gulf Coast. Otherwise, some very good flying conditions across the Panhandle into Canada. But looking back across the Arctic coast, looking at IFR conditions there with some areas of fog across that region and IFR conditions through much of the Bering Sea. And then on the south side of Alaska Peninsula, looking at some IFR conditions there with otherwise marginal conditions through the Gulf of Alaska. And for Saturday afternoon, looking at some thunderstorm activity anywhere between the Yukon Flats area into the uplands, but otherwise generally very good flying conditions across much of the mainland. You have to go over to the western coast to get into marginal conditions there, and marginal conditions down through the Gulf of Alaska. Otherwise, again, some pretty good flying conditions across the Panhandle with the ridge of high pressure over that region of the state. Otherwise, the IFR condition continues to linger across the Arctic coast and down through the Bering Sea and south side Alaska Peninsula. Then for Sunday morning, again, some IFR conditions out there in the Bering Sea and portions of the south side Alaska Peninsula and along the Arctic coast. Otherwise, marginal conditions from basically the Brooks Range down through the southwest and into portions of the Alaska Range. Also some marginal conditions expected in the Gulf of Alaska. But again, looking at some pretty good flying conditions across much of the Panhandle with the ridge continuing to dominate that region of the state. Then for flying weather on Saturday afternoon, not expecting as much thunderstorm activity Sunday afternoon across the eastern interior, but otherwise marginal conditions across the west and into the Brooks Range and in the Gulf of Alaska. IFR conditions across the Arctic coast and portions of the Bering Sea with those conditions beginning to break up there. Otherwise, lingering conditions of IFR flying conditions across the south side Alaska Peninsula. For pass conditions on Saturday, Anaktuvik Pass marginal conditions there, as well as Adigan. Then as you get into the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill, marginal conditions expected for the day on Saturday, and then for rainy marginal conditions there as well. Windy Pass went for marginal, improving to VFR conditions, again for Saturday. Isabel, marginal, improving to VFR conditions. And then for Isabel, marginal, improving to VFR conditions is there. And then Mentasta Pass, VFR conditions all day there on Saturday. And for Tanita, on the west entrance, I expect some IFR conditions there during the day. Otherwise, marginal, improving to VFR conditions for Tanita Pass. And then for Portage, marginal, improving to VFR conditions during the day, improving there. And then for the Panhandle, again, very good flying conditions across that region, but in Chilkoot and White Pass, VFR conditions expected in those two passes. For the freezing level on Saturday morning, looking at 6,000 feet across the northern Bering Sea, and that spreads over into the southwest portion of the mainland. And then elevations increased across the eastern mainland as you get into Canada, reaching a maximum of around 14,000 feet there. And then elevated freezing levels across the southern Bering Sea with up to 12,000 feet expected there in that area, and portions of the southern Gulf with 12,000 foot freezing level analyzed there. For the icy conditions on Saturday, above 8,000 feet across the west coast with considerable moderate in some of those areas, and then some isolated moderate in the Brooks Range and eastern Arctic coast there. Otherwise down through the eastern Aleutians and into the Alaska Peninsula, looking at above 12,000 feet there and isolated moderate to considerable moderate areas expected. For the jet stream on Saturday, looking at westerly winds coming into the west coast up to 80 knots and then decreasing to 60 knots as you get into the central mainland, and then increasing again as you get into Canada, but otherwise light and variable across the Panhandle and in the Gulf of Alaska, increasing flow just south of the Aleutians there up to 85 knots analyzed at the jet stream level. Then for 9,000 foot winds, Southwesterly flow coming into the west coast there, otherwise up to 45 knots there, decreasing across the mainland up to 35 knots as you get into the border, and again increasing flow as you get near the Aleutians. And then for 3,000 foot winds on Saturday, southwesterly flow coming into the west coast up to 45 knots there, light and variable across the mainland and into the panhandle again. Very good flying weather again across that region, and increasing flow across the Aleutians and south of that area. Then for turbulence on Saturday, surface to 4,000 feet with considerable moderate expected across portions of the southwest and into Alaska Peninsula, and anywhere between surface and 3,000 feet across the area of the central Aleutians.